We see the headlines about massive lawsuits and market monopolies, but we rarely see the actual mechanics of how they're being fought. This is EconWorks. We look past the talking points to find where law, economics, and markets actually collide. Let's get into it.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the anatomy of a massive, newly settled healthcare antitrust case. It's a legal showdown that took literally years to build, grabbed the attention of the entire industry, and ultimately impacts the medical bills we all pay. And yet, it ended so quietly that the biggest legal questions were left completely unanswered. So let's get into it. Here is the multi-billion-dollar antitrust question sitting at the very heart of this case. Traditionally, antitrust agencies review massive, high-profile mergers one transaction at a time. But what happens when a company executes a roll-up? That's when they make dozens of smaller acquisitions that individually fly right under the radar, but collectively, they reshape an entire industry. Well, that is exactly what the Federal Trade Commission set out to test. Imagine a decade's worth of individual acquisitions interlocking like pieces of a giant puzzle. Back in 2023, the FTC sued a major Texas anesthesia provider and its private equity backer. The government argued that all these separate acquisitions should actually be viewed as one long anti-competitive strategy. But then, in April 2026, the case just settled before trial. No verdict, no judicial ruling on that core legal theory. Just a confidential agreement that quietly ended the immediate dispute. All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. A quiet antitrust settlement. 2. Anatomy of a roll-up. 3. Defining the monopoly market. 4. The defense strikes back. And finally, 5. The structural remedy problem.
Starting with Section 1, a quiet antitrust settlement. The unresolved legal question.
So this settlement means the immediate legal fight between the FTC and the Texas anesthesia provider? It's over. Interestingly, the private equity investor had already been dismissed from the case in 2024. The core company admitted absolutely no wrongdoing, and the terms of that April 2026 settlement remain strictly confidential. But here's the catch. The much larger debate around private equity roll-ups, healthcare consolidation, and the actual limits of modern antitrust enforcement, that whole shebang remains completely unresolved. Moving to Section 2, Anatomy of a Roll-Up, the FTC's allegations. The FTC's complaint outlined a really specific three-part playbook. First, the roll-up itself. This meant acquiring many of the largest anesthesia groups across Texas over time, especially in Houston, to gain massive leverage over commercial insurers. Second, pricing arrangements. The FTC alleged this dominant provider allowed the remaining independent groups to bill insurers through their contracts at higher rates, and then both sides just shared the extra cash. And third, market allocation. They allegedly struck agreements with other large providers to completely avoid competing in certain territories. And the FTC definitely didn't hold back in painting a picture of an aggressive consolidation strategy. They highlighted internal emails where executives were literally celebrating rate increases with cha-ching. And remember, those are increases that ultimately trickle down to our insurance premiums and medical bills. Meanwhile, commercial insurers describe the company's pricing strategy as peanut butter spreading, basically taking their high rates and spreading them evenly across all their newly acquired practices in Texas. For the government, it was clear. This firm was leveraging its bargaining power to jack up prices across the board. Section 3, Defining the Monopoly Market. The prosecution's narrow view. If you follow antitrust economics, you know that market definition is everything. It's the specific boundaries used to calculate a company's market share. We're talking geography, patient type, the specific kind of facility. Broaden that definition, and a company's market share naturally shrinks. Narrow it down, and bam, market share skyrockets. So here's how the FTC's economic expert handled it. They defined the market very strictly. Actually, scratch that. They made it extremely narrow, looking only at hospital-based anesthesia, only for commercially insured patients, and only in specific metros like Houston. The FTC argued this made total sense because patients getting hospital procedures can't just casually switch to an outpatient center. They certainly can't skip anesthesia, and they can't just suddenly switch to Medicare. Under these super strict boundaries, the FTC calculated that the defendant controlled a staggering 70% of the market in Houston. Which brings us to Section 4, the defense strikes back. 4 major counterarguments. Naturally, the defense came back swinging with 4 really powerful criticisms. First, they flat out accused the FTC of gerrymandering the market by excluding ambulatory surgery centers, or ASCs. They argued that hospitals and ASCs fiercely compete for anesthesiologists and contracts. Second, they claimed the FTC focused on the wrong competition entirely. Anesthesia providers compete for facility contracts, not individual patients. Third, they pointed out the FTC never even established what a competitive price should actually be, especially since the Houston practice was already large and expensive before these acquisitions even started. And fourth, in a kind of ironic twist, they highlighted that the alleged victims in this whole monopoly scheme were actually some of the largest multi-billion-dollar insurance companies in America. When you stack these two economic viewpoints side by side, it's just a fascinating intellectual battle. On one side, the FTC sees a narrow, trapped market at the absolute mercy of a dominant provider. On the flip side, the defense sees a broad, highly dynamic market where providers are fighting for hospital contracts while negotiating against massive insurance giants. It's a fundamental disagreement over where and how competition actually happens in modern healthcare. Moving to our final section, Section 5, the structural remedy problem. What if the market was already concentrated? Okay, here is the deep structural paradox at the absolute center of this case. According to the FTC's own data, the very first major acquisition the defendant made gave them roughly 50% market share in Houston, meaning the roll-up didn't create concentration from scratch. If later acquisitions push that share from 50% up to 70%, what exactly is the legal remedy here? Even if a judge orders the company to divest those later deals, you're still left with a dominant firm controlling half the market. The government's theory of how the market was harmed and their theory of how to actually fix it never really lined up. And you know, this headache isn't entirely unique to anesthesia. It echoes other massive antitrust fights over retrospective acquisitions. Think of the FTC's case involving Meta buying Instagram and WhatsApp. Now, the legal frameworks do differ. This anesthesia case focused on cumulative acquisitions under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, while the Meta case leans heavily on monopolization under Section 2 of the Sherman Act. But they both share the exact same underlying challenge. How does competition law restore a market after an industry's business ecosystem has already evolved around prior transactions? It's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. That unresolved tension is exactly what makes the timeline of this case so important. The FTC spent years building a legal framework for this. They launched inquiries in 2022, they drafted new merger guidelines, filed this specific complaint in 2023, and finalized those guidelines. The stage was perfectly set for a landmark judicial ruling. But because of that April 2026 settlement, courts never fully resolved how far cumulative acquisition theories can actually extend. The legal precedent remains totally untested. By the time regulators finally intervene in a roll-up, the independent firms might be long gone, the contracts are consolidated, and competitive relationships are permanently altered. So I leave you with this to consider. The unresolved question in antitrust today is no longer whether serial acquisitions can increase market concentration over time. The real question is, can antitrust law effectively restore competition once that consolidation is already complete? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.
Thanks for watching. For the deep dive economic analysis behind these stories, join us at econworks.com. Subscribe to stay informed on where law and economics meet the market. We'll see you in the next episode.